Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of The Experience Creators. I'm so happy that you joined me. My name is Carolene and I'm your host. And today I'm introducing you to Daan van Rossum, who is the Chief Experience Officer at Dreamplex, an incredible company of 5 flexible office spaces around Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi in Vietnam. Daan's background is in marketing strategy across global markets, and his work in this field has resulted in him winning numerous international industry awards. Daan also founded his own startup, Bright, which enabled and inspired young Vietnamese to find their why and live their lives towards it. This sense of letting people live purposefully is now a core tenet at the work that he does at Dreamplex. And today, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to talk about how to create an inspiring and engaging workplace for your teams. So without further ado, let's dive into the interview. Hi Daan, and welcome to the Experience Creators. I have spent all morning looking at so much content about Dreamplex, and it has got me so excited to speak to you. So welcome to the show.
All right. Well, good morning to you too. Thank you for having me. And clearly it's not good morning here. I'm sitting here in a very dark conference room, so I'm sorry for the lighting, but yeah, that's what we have to deal with today.
No problem at all. I want to dive straight into the first question that I ask every single one of my guests, and that is, what elements make up a great experience in your own experience, in your own opinion, in your own words?
Okay, so yeah, that is not only a good question, but probably also like a quite difficult one to really
Yes.
think about. But basically, if I look at it from my area of quote unquote expertise, I think one of the things that's really remarkable about experience when we talk to people about like how to build experiences is that it's just so many facets. There's so many things that have to come together to create that experience. And in the workplace, which is obviously what I really focus on, it really is a lot of things that you don't even realize or that you don't even like, they're not tangible. So for a great workplace to deliver a great experience, it's not only sort of the first things that you see, it's really kind of like the air that you breathe in, the scent that sort of surrounds you, the music that's playing, the general kind of like amount of noise from like people chatting, maybe like some dishware from the cafe in the background, the kind of greenery around you, the amount of light, is it natural light, is it artificial light? So really all those things together kind of create that sense of like, oh, this is where I am, and whether that's like a positive experience or a negative one. So I would say like what defines an experience, I would say complexity, because it's a
Right.
lot of different things that go into it. Yeah.
I love that, and especially thinking about elements that you wouldn't usually think about, right? And I know when I'm working with my clients, I ask so many thought-provoking questions, like how do you want your guests to feel? How do you want the experience to impact them? And oftentimes it's things that they haven't even thought about yet. So I love that
Of
idea of
course,
like
yeah.
that idea of complexity. Like how can we actually think of so many other things around us that we've never really thought of before, or that we
Mm.
didn't realize actually had an impact on us. Let's talk about Dreamplex. I love talking about employee experience. I love talking about really how you can create a really positive environment around you, both physically and then obviously mentally. So share with us what is Dreamplex, what is it all about, and what you guys do.
Yeah, so this is really amazing because we are a sort of like a workplace experience provider in Vietnam. So even though I talk about the company, there's absolutely no commercial angle to it, because like the chances that someone is listening to this who is a prospect customer for us is quite small. So I can just share with it quite openly. Basically, kind of what we've done over the last couple of years is to think about work. And work is one of those things that can be either really positive and generative, or it can be something that kind of like drags you down and makes you feel like, oh gosh, yet another day, sort of the Monday morning feeling. And because we spend so much time at work, there's those calculations out there that, on average, we'll spend 90,000 hours in our lives, 100,000 hours in our lives. Or if you're a startup founder like me, maybe even more. But you spend, like a really, really big portion of your life at work. So we always say, if you can make work great, you can make life great. And we think, and I think a lot of companies would acknowledge that there's sort of like something mutually beneficial to a great workplace experience and a great employee experience. Because as an employee, if you feel really good and if you feel kind of like positive and stimulated and engaged, you typically do better work, right? Like you're in a much better kind of like mindset to do great work, especially when you think about creativity and collaboration and sort of like innovation, those kind of things. So what we really focus on, we originally started as a co-working space about 5 years ago, but we were collecting a lot of data and insights around, what makes a great workplace. And so now we focus a little bit more on mid-sized companies, enterprise market, and really have kind of like dissected, what do the best workplaces in the world have in common. So when you think about, great companies to work for, like a Google or maybe like Instagram, or we just saw the new TikTok offices in LA, like so cool, so beautiful. So when you think about some of those like companies, what is it that they're doing in kind of like both the physical workplace and everything around it that makes you feel really great and that makes you feel engaged, and that's basically what we deliver. So our key thing is, there is a lot of hours that we spend at work. So, we think we can make a meaningful contribution to people's lives if we make that something very enjoyable. And with that, we hope to attract the kind of companies that care about their employees, and the kind of employees that say, yeah, that's kind of like the kind of environment that I want to be in.
Right. And yeah, I think a lot about my physical space, as a full-time traveler and somebody who's living in Airbnbs or hotels. And as a remote worker, one of the first things that I do when I get into my new space is look around and kind of decide or rearrange furniture and look at where the light's coming in and try and decide,
Mm,
okay, how am I going to set up this space so it's conducive to me actually really
mm,
working quite productively, being very creative, being really inspired. And oftentimes it is quite challenging because I just have the what I have around me, the furniture that I have around me or the light that I have around me. So when you are looking at these spaces that you
mm.
guys have from an experience design point of view and a physical point of view, what are the considerations that you guys start with? How do you approach that? And what are the most important aspects that you really focus on when you're looking at, okay, we need to create an incredible space?
Yeah, so the number one thing that we do, and I think the reason that companies work with providers like us, is that we sort of have an expertise in being user centric, and when you think about workplaces and offices, especially when you use the word office, a lot of people think about these very dreary kind of
Right.
spaces with bad lighting and like maybe a little shabby pantry or something like
Right.
that. And so, workplaces have typically been very employer centric. They've really been focused on what does the company need, which is, to put as many people as possible in as small a space as possible and with as minimal cost as possible, right? So that is what people typically think about when it comes to an office. And we, in having to deliver a very competitive product and something that is really significantly better than the typical office, we really start with the in a startup, you would say with the user, but in our case, the employee.
Right.
And so we really approach it from a very employee-centric perspective, from a very human perspective. Even something like the term human doesn't really get used a lot when we talk about offices. So human-centric, employee-centric design. So we start with like, who are the people that are going to be in this office? And what are their wants and needs? And what is it that we can provide to them that makes them feel great and again engaged, inspired, productive, creative. And so where do we start? We start with like a deep study of the people in our workplaces. Vietnam is, I think, a very unique country in that the young population is really big in terms of like people coming into the workforce, because there is sort of a gap in education and skill. So if companies want to hire great sales talent, great marketing talent, great designers, great developers, they typically are young. Like I would say that like most people in our spaces are all between 22 and like 35. So I always feel very old walking around here. But so that means that you're really targeting like a Gen Z and millennial audience. And so when we're designing workspaces, especially when we design new buildings, but even if we're retrofitting existing buildings, we have to start with that. Like, what is it that motivates and drives millennials and Gen Zs in Vietnam? So really dive deep into kind of like their wants, hope, needs, desires, and then you can build an entire experience around it. And I think you talked about physical space, and of course, for us, it's super important to get the physical space right. But we also know that, some of the most beautiful places in the world in terms of like offices and buildings, they can be incredibly beautiful. But if there's no vibe, if there's no atmosphere, if there's no sense of, yeah, I love being here, then it still doesn't work. So all those things that I mentioned very early on in terms of like, what's the music that you're playing? What activities are announced on the posters that surround you? What happens within the building? How do you connect with other people within that? Like all these things really are also important beyond just kind of like the basics of the physical space. And one of the key things that we would start with is kind of like spatial planning. So you're kind of looking at a blank canvas when you're doing office design or workplace design. So you're looking at this like huge white box basically, and how are we going to put different zones in there of like where people work, where people relax, where people play. In Vietnam, also very important, where people sleep, because people typically take a sort of like a nap during lunch.
Okay.
So all those elements, that's really the starting point, and then you kind of like build from there, building on those zones.
And what are some additional elements? So you've got this physical space, you've created an inspiring kind of area, like you said, with an amazing vibe. You guys seem to be also really, really great at the additional elements that really come in play here. So whether it's hospitality or whether it's putting on events. So can you talk a little bit about what you guys do that goes beyond that physical workspace?
Yeah, so first and foremost, I would definitely not say that we're great at it, but we're trying a lot of stuff just to sort of see what works and what doesn't in very true startup fashion. Build, measure, learn, basically constantly kind of like revising, trying to be as agile as possible. So what is it that we layer onto the space? Yes, so basically there's two layers that we do on top of the physical space. Actually, three layers as of 2021, three layers that we put on the physical space. So the first one, as you mentioned, is hospitality. So I think one of the things that really came out of the whole kind of like COVID experience is that, both companies and employees understand more than ever that why you come to an office really isn't to just do focused work, because typically you can kind of do that anywhere. You can typically find a space somewhere to sit down and, sit on your laptop and do your work. Like the world is digital and mobile enough right now to kind of facilitate that. Very different from just 5 or 10 years ago. But sort of with that in mind, the role that an office plays is very different. So it's much more about socializing. It's much more about like running into people. Maybe you come into the office to, like have a big brainstorm, or like have like a creative workshop, or to work together with people on something. Or maybe it's because you kind of like miss sort of like casually running into people, being somewhere where every now and then someone taps you on the shoulder, or you pass someone in the hallway and says like, hey, what's up? Like, Carol, like, how are you doing? So that's why people come to the offices. And that's also why I think the importance of hospitality is even bigger than it was, basically the year before. And so when we started, we basically had receptionists who could kind of like help you with, printing something, or maybe if you were a foreigner like me, they could call for you to a local shop to order like a laptop piece or something like that. But we've basically over time have replaced receptionists or upskilled, uptrained receptionists with people from hospitality backgrounds. So we're hiring away mostly now from 5-star hotels, from resorts, from international hotel schools. And those people get something that typical office workers wouldn't get, which is that sense of how do you make people feel like they belong? So when you think about like walking into a really great restaurant, a really great hotel, especially the nicer ones, there's sort of that sense of like coming home. There's that sense of belonging. There's that sense of like, I'm being cared for here. And Danny Meyer, who I really love, like great, like hospitality thinker, he calls that HQ, right? Like how you would have IQ and EQ. He says really good hospitality people have like a hospitality quotient. He calls it HQ. Okay. And in that you have things like empathy, and kindness. Like how can you make people feel at home, or how can you give people a great experience if you're not empathetic, right? Like if you're like sort of like a very binary, like 1-0 thinker. And so, and kindness, like, are you kind? Like, do you generally want to care for people? And if you have that HQ, he says, then it's way easier to do the job, because it doesn't sort of like wear you out when day in, day out. You have to greet people and listen to people's problems and support them in kind of like all the things that they need. So hospitality is a really big part of, I think, what office buildings now need to be, which is that place that people love going to, because from the moment you step in, you kind of feel that care that comes from the people that face you. So from a physical design perspective, like we design now reception desks to actually face the entrance and then curve around so that they also face the workspace. So there's always someone kind of like facing you and then people facing the workspace. So that's layer number one. Layer number two is engagement. So not to make this too long, we can go into that separately. But that's basically what's happening in this space. Is what are the activities that we can organize to make sure that there's always something for you to do there. And that really borrows a lot from employee experience and employee engagement principles. And so that's why a lot of our team is really kind of like coming in from an HR background rather than just like a design background. And then the third layer is technology. So basically, how can you use sensors? How can you use, we have like an app. How can you use kind of like data collection to continuously learn more about the people in your space, how they use the space, what they engage with, and therefore further optimize kind of what we offer. And all of that together creates experience, and then hopefully, an experience that improves over time.
I mean, just the sounds of working in a place like that. I mean, no wonder you're called Dreamplex. It does sound like a very positive, a very developmental environment. And I know from an employee experience point of view, I've read a lot of studies recently really focusing on millennials and looking at this aspect of learning and development and how crucial it is in the roles that they take on and the companies that they work for. And they see that as almost an expectation as part of their role. If they're not going to have those opportunities, then how on earth are they going to grow not only with the company but as themselves, as individuals? And so what are some examples of those? Do you do some kind of events? Do you have speakers? Do you have mentorships? Like what are some of those aspects of the employee experience that second level that you mentioned that you can share with us?
So basically, all of the above. So everything that you mentioned is kind of being addressed. So we really go back to that point. Like we said, it's really being employee centric, people centric. What do people really want from a workplace? I mean, of course, there is sort of like that salary component. There aren't that many people that would still work even if they didn't get paid. Like maybe I'm one of the few who would just like is intrinsically motivated to work in that sense. But we really do it, I think, to learn more about ourselves, feel like we're making progress in life, feel like we're growing, that we're kind of like developing. And so we really play into that quite heavily. One of the key sort of like one of the main insights from our Gen Z study that we just released last month was actually that that's now even surpassing millennials. So for millennials, it's salary number one, growth and development number two. In Gen Z is actually flipped. So they actually, their primary motivator for going to work, this young generation in Vietnam, is to learn. And there are some interesting cultural nuances there, which we can get into. But basically, so how do we then do it, right? So how do we then sort of support companies in doing training and development? Again, in the same way that like old school co-working was all about companies who couldn't afford their own huge office or their own kind of like Googleplex campus type thing. Right. So you bundle all these companies together and you share the physical space, right? So I think very similarly, we approach training and development from the same perspective. So we go around all of the companies that are sitting in our spaces and we ask them, what is it that your team wants to learn? Like, what are the things that they really want to kind of like grow and develop themselves into? And typically, it's always kind of like 50-50 hard skill and soft skill. So it's 50%, I just want to get better at my job because that allows me to progress in my career. That allows me to maybe get to that next level, the next title, the next salary bump. And then the other part is really soft skill. Like, do I feel like I'm growing as a person on the same way that I'm growing as a professional? And so then we take those topics. We also look at something like World Economic Forum put out this idea of the 10 skills for the 21st century. Like what are those like critical skills that even if like AI and automation is going to replace a lot of what we do, what are those key skills that we still need? And so we look at something like that. We look at kind of like the data coming back from our member companies, like what are they employees, what are they interested in learning? And then we sort of develop a curriculum. So we do it basically in three sort of different flavors. The first one is what we call Dreamplex Academy, which is basically 3-month courses in all of the key subjects that we know like our kind of like member base wants to learn about, which means that you come into a classroom where there's a group of people there, which kind of goes back to community, that are maybe from different companies. Like maybe you bring 1 or 2 colleagues, but then there's also like 20 people from different companies. but you all have the same learning goal. So there's something there to connect you. So typically we open with people getting to know each other and like, why are you here? And like what binds us basically before we even get into the subjects. And then, you learn over the course of the 3 months a certain topic. There's a little bit of like homework. So you go away, you apply certain things, you come back with questions like, what did I get? What did I not get? And then you get that to completion. You get a nice little certificate, and then you can sign up for the next course if you want. So one of the examples in Vietnam that's like a highly popular one is English pronunciation. So like Vietnamese know that if they can speak English well, that it immediately gives them a huge bump in their career. So there's, I think there's some numbers out there that you can literally make 50 to 100% more for the exact same skill set, but if you speak English or not speak English, because then you kind of like open yourself up to the world. So that is one of the courses that we do. We do leadership, we do communication, we do also like things like design thinking and all that. Number two is kind of like a program of speakers. So we have, a lot of people coming in to speak about a certain topic. So maybe you don't want to follow like a whole course, but you're actually quite curious about experience design, for example. And then you could come in and like hear an expert talk about that. And again, like there's a networking community event sort of like linked to that. So you also get to know new people, and it's kind of like an interesting experience. And then the third one is one-on-one mentoring. So kind of acknowledging that, especially for smaller companies, let's say between 20 to 100, 150 people, there isn't always a senior version of you in that company. So you may be in a smaller company, kind of like the only finance person or the only HR person, or maybe you're the only growth marketer. And so we basically have a network of people that dedicate their time to our members, where you can book 30-minute slots with experts in their field and basically say, please help me, I'm stuck. There's all these demands to me as the expert within the company, but actually I have no idea how to do it. And normally when you work in a bigger company, we just go to your boss or their boss or their boss. Right. But in smaller companies, you don't have that, so you can tap into these experts and basically ask them for advice. So in many ways, you can sort of like learn, grow, develop, and sort of have that sense of I'm growing towards something that I'm proud of.
And I love that idea of that community element. I know when at Cirque du Soleil, when I created some employee development programs for touring employees, the most successful of the events that I created and held were the ones where I brought outside people into our little bubble of the tour, and actually where they could have conversations and they could kind of vibe off each other and network a little bit. And it was incredible to see. It was almost like an unexpected result that I really wasn't expecting at all. But it was amazing just to see, like, when you have somebody coming in and they live a completely different life, they're from a different world, but their expertise is so relevant to what you're actually doing. So I love that idea of what, that goes to what you're doing in that idea of, okay, we have this community, let's find these experts that are really going to elevate these individuals, but let's do it in a really community style of learning, where you are actually interacting with different companies, right? Maybe in the same building, but different companies. Oh, that's incredible.
And we've seen, well, first of all, I have to really credit Priya Parker, who is the author of the book, The Art of Gathering. And The Art of Gathering is basically like the Bible for planning events, like any kind of like gathering, clearly, right? So, she goes from dinner parties to, huge events. But the principles really are about, when you do any kind of gathering, she even like goes into like corporate meetings, and why are meetings so incredibly horrible? It's because usually the first 10 minutes are spent on, adjusting your chair, people looking around, wait, who is leading this meeting? What's the agenda? Why are we here? And so basically she has kind of like different steps to address kind of like, how do you create a great gathering, whether it's a meeting or a big dinner party, or in our case, training and development. It's you have to purposefully design every step of that experience. So from the moment that you get invited to something, is it clear what the agenda is? Is it clear what's expected of you? What is something that you can do to prepare well for that event, that gathering? When you then step into the event for the first time, how are you greeted? What happens then? For example, like I would say our country is quite introverted, or there's a lot less of that sort of, what you would see in other markets where, you would do a community event and people just like, they go out networking, handing out business cards. Like here, it's very much like sort of like wildflower, kind of like stick to the side, a little bit shy and introverted. So there, it's then even more important that basically, like if we organize something and you walk into that physical space, that there's someone to immediately sort of, again, that have that sort of like empathetic sense of what it must be like for you to go into this strange space with 40, 50 people kind of like standing around to kind of like pick you up and say, okay, here's what we do. And so, like, for example, in training and development, there's always a group exercise. It doesn't matter what the topic is. There's always something where it's about, let's go around the table. And for example, why do you want to learn English pronunciation? And you hear people's goals and you immediately have that human connection, which you don't have if the teacher says, okay, thanks for coming and let's start, right? It's completely lacking. So that book, The Art of Gathering, definitely fueled a lot of our thinking around, how do you design the experience of coming into a sort of like a training and development setting. And then the additional benefit of thinking about community is that if you go to a certain topic, it's clearly because you care about it or because there's something that you're trying to get out of it. And the same goes for those other 15 or 20 people. So if I go to, let's say, an HR training, then clearly I'm surrounded by people who are probably at the same level as me, who want to like scale up in their knowledge and sort of skills when it comes to HR. And so now all of a sudden, instead of being the only HR person in a small company, I am part of a network of 15 HR people that I can now reach out to and say, oh, I'm running into this issue. Like, how would I solve it? Like, what have you done? Who here has experience about that? So we typically also connect them in like a WhatsApp group or kind of like a Facebook group. So yeah, we're trying to bring people together in many different ways, all sort of connecting as people around, I think, what drives us in life, which is, the sense of progression, the sense of growing and development.
I have to say that everyone that I've interviewed thus far, when I've asked them what are those key elements of the experience, everyone in their own way has included that level of human connection. And you just touched on it there. And really that idea of collaboration over competition and really finding like-minded people around you that you can connect with, that you can vibe off. And in your case, they're not even within the same company. They're with other people around them that are potentially going through the same thing, but maybe in a little bit of a different way. And those are really where those growth opportunities are, where they're present, where they occur. So
totally, yeah.
Oh, so thought-provoking. My brain is like buzzing right now. I read
you must have you read that book before?
I have it. It's been a while since I've read it, but now that you've talked it up
good to revisit.
Time, I'm gonna go back to it. To finish up, the last question that I wanted to ask you was, I want to bring some practical tips. So if somebody watching this is a CEO or they're a startup founder and they have a space and they've listened to this interview and they're like, oh my gosh, like I need to do something with my space. I want to make it more inspiring. I want to create a lot more impact in what I'm providing for my employees. What's maybe like 2 to 3 things what are the first steps? Like we talk about it conceptually. We've given a lot of examples as well. We've compared to some other amazing companies, but what's like maybe 2 to 3 first step things, tangible things that they can do if they really want to evaluate their space, evaluate their employee experience, and then make some changes? What can they do?
So if you're in Vietnam, call me.
Yes.
If you're outside of Vietnam,
that was going to be the next the lead on.
Yeah. No, but so basically, like we always like say the same thing. Like it's really nice to hear the theory. It's really nice to hear people talk about all the great things you can do. You need to get practical.
Yeah.
And so to go back to what I said earlier, the first step is always to listen. So before you do anything, before you say, oh, like I saw this, like, I just looked at the TikTok office in LA, designed by Gensler, which is like one of my idol architecture firms, and they have like these like really cool like neon lights that kind of like track through the entire building, which I think is supposed to visualize like how all the connections of humanity are happening through TikTok or something like that. But you could look at that and say, oh, that's cool. So I need to put that in my office, right? Maybe not so extravagant, but maybe something like that. And it kind of like skips the whole point that Genser probably recommended it as a design element because they've studied who are the TikTok employees and what would they want and what are the current cultural trends in that specific market, in that specific segment of employees. So step number one is always to listen. And that could be kind of like, depending on the skill of the company, could be an employee survey. So it could basically be, you just sending out a survey saying, we really want to hear from you, and ask some typical kind of design thinking questions. So what is the stuff that you love? What is the stuff you can cope with? And what's the stuff you hate, right? That's usually a really great starting point.
Right.
Then you can analyze that data, or if the company is smaller or you have the time, you can do focus groups. You can basically, get a group of employees together and ask them about their inputs. You can do other, typical UX kind of things when you do like user research. You could do observations. So you could basically just sit in a space for a while and see how people interact with the space. Maybe there are certain elements that you thought was a great idea, like a little mini library, and it turns out your employees actually don't like reading at all, or they feel awkward to sit with a book because then other people can see them being not productive or whatever it is. So space observations are a great thing to do. You can do individual user interviews. So like what we do a lot is to go to certain spaces, and when people exit the space, to say, oh, can I ask you just 2 or 3 questions? It's like, you just used our pantry. Can you mention one thing that you liked about that experience? Like maybe something that you would like us to improve. So basically in the moment, after people have just experienced something, get the data. So listen, collect the data. And then, again, this really goes back to like UX research. Take all that data and start sort of analyzing it, start grouping together clusters of insights into, what sort of like directions could we start thinking about. And then you can start ideating. So based on the insights that are kind of like grouped together from individual comments or findings, you could go into kind of like, what are some solutions that I could bring into the workplace? So I would really say, like, ignore any blog, ignore this, ignore Pinterest, ignore everything that you hear, because if you jump to execution, it's never a good thing. Just listen to the people. They will always give the absolute best guidance for what to do. And then, of course, when you have those insights and kind of like maybe the key pain points, or as there's this like stream of thinking called appreciative inquiry, which is basically only build on the good, forget about the pain points, forget about what people don't like, just ask what you're good at and do more of it. That's typically really good for building company culture as well, because it's already something you're good at, so you can amplify it. But basically, like, look at all those things and then go from there. And then you can maybe research like, oh, what have other companies done to get better at this, or to be even better at something.
To those specific details that you're seeing. Yeah, I know. I think another powerful tool where, you said sitting in the space and listening as well to your employees, actually, especially the new employees, really asking them how they have, what their experience is. I know at Cirque du Soleil, when I set up the VIP space, the very first thing that I did when I received my new team from the hiring agency was I got them to do a walkthrough and fill out a little, gave them all a clipboard, and the questions were really like, okay, what's the very first thing that you notice? Okay, where did you go and sit? Which bar did you go to? Like, did you immediately know where the bathrooms were? Did you know how to get to the show straight away? Was it obvious? Like, what's the thing that surprised you the most? Or what's the thing that you were expecting to see that you didn't? And as soon as I implemented that, man, things started to change very quickly for the positive, because I saw the same thing every day, all day, every day, 7 days a week almost. And so, of course, then you have some blinders on you, don't you? But when I'm really asking these kind of questions to people that have never been in the space before, what is their first week's experience? Man, the data that I got from that and the positive improvements that I was able to make were just phenomenal. I was even surprised at how great that strategy was. I was like, wow, I'm so glad I thought of this,
So what drove that? Yeah, like what was the sort of the inspiration for going on that kind of research?
For me, first of all, we were changing countries every 6 to 8 weeks, or cities or countries every 6 to 8 weeks. So the demographic or the behavior of my guests was consistently changing. And it was a great playground for me, because for the most part, we would only really, somebody may come back and see the show in a 6 to 8 week period, but for the most part, people were coming once. Maybe the super
Right.
fans were coming
Right.
2 to 3 times, but for the most part they were coming once. So I could implement something very easily, a small tweak on one evening, and then if it worked, I could continue with that. Or if it didn't work, I could almost forget that it didn't happen, because the next night
Right.
I had new guests. But
Yeah.
what the element for me that was really interesting was that my staff were local staff and my guests were local guests for the most part. I was not the local at all. So I
Yeah.
was coming in with the expertise from the job that I was doing and the space that I was
Yeah.
creating, but I was very intrigued to see the elements from that local point of view.
Yeah.
So there was this really amazing insight, are the guests showing up? There's some countries I know very well that the guests are going to show up late a lot, and other countries where they're going to be extremely orderly and polite and line up in the line. And, so there's so many different elements when you start to cross cultural barriers. And for me, the biggest insights were my local staff. And so actually having them do that walkthrough, I saw so many things that I didn't see on a daily basis. Maybe even down to things like cabling. They noticed this cabling on the grounds that I thought I'd covered it up pretty nicely, but clearly I didn't. They saw it. So wow, it was such a great strategy. So that's one that anyone that's listening, if you have some new guys in your team, that's something that you can do straight away. Get them to do a walkthrough and see what their experience is.
But typically, this is also the barrier, right? So like, the reason that a lot of people don't do it is because people really hate getting feedback.
Right.
I think to innovate and to improve, you need to sort of have like quite thick skin, because you've probably put a lot of effort into like hiding those cables, and you maybe don't want someone to point out that like, hey, Carol, I can see those cables, it looks really messy.
Right.
You immediately feel like, oh, okay, like, guys, I worked super hard on that. Like, it's kind of offensive for you to say that, right? So you kind of need to have that sense of, okay, I'm open to any kind of feedback. This is just to improve the experience. And I think like business leaders, they're like, man, I have so many things to do. The last thing I want is like a list of complaints from my staff that, hey, I'm already paying them. Like, why do I need to like care about their opinions? But, we do see, of course, on the other end, that if you create like a truly employee-centered workplace, and people feel like, oh, I'm part of this great company, this great brand, this great culture. You have all these great examples in the world of companies that people just like, they die for, like they just love being part of that, that sense of like, almost like family. So that it can totally improve, your employee retention, your employee engagement. So, but it's sometimes so hard to be so vulnerable and to kind of like open yourself up to people saying basically, what do you do wrong? And obviously, like, I'm sure if you read any kind of like leadership literature, right, like one of the key things that you need to be as a leader is just being you just need to be open to feedback, and you need to be able to take, right? you need to be able to take it. But yeah, it's
usually
typically
always
so
the
hard.
first chapter in leadership.
Right. Yeah. Like, and so when you were asking about like practically what can people do, I think actually the biggest barrier for people to overcome is to even be open to kind of like getting that feedback.
Right.
It's so difficult.
But so important. And I think, like you said, if the employees feel, and this goes back to employee experience, if they feel that they're part of something greater than the job that they're coming and doing on a day-to-day basis, if they feel like they're part of this community, this tribe, and you're all working together to create something amazing and something that you're really proud of, you're naturally going to be able to create that reciprocal relationship that's actually built on positivity, and not like, you mentioned, here's a list of complaints. It's actually more very constructive and let's work together so that we can create something even more amazing than we have. I love that.
Yeah.
Dan, thank you so much. Oh my gosh, I could honestly talk about this all day with you. I love this topic, and I love what Dreamplex are doing, and I'm really excited to continue learning more about employee experience through Dreamplex and through everything that you're doing. So I want to say a huge thank you for coming on the Experience Creators, and above all, thank you for really having that focus and being an incredible experience creator yourself.
My pleasure for being here, and thank you for having this podcast, this interview show, because I think it's so great that people can learn. Probably not like what I'm sharing. I'm not sure how interesting that was, but just like all these kind of like creators coming on sharing, how to build experiences, and also like just to kind of, you need people like you to sort of spread the gospel of, how important experience is. So yeah, I should really say like a big thank you to you for doing all this.
Well, I think in everybody, you have so many learnings and insights in the places that you least expect, right? And that's why I always try and get such an array of people from many different experiential realities, because you can learn so much from an experienced creator creating something in a completely different field than you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of The Experience Creators. Both Daan and myself really hope that you enjoyed the conversation. You took down a bunch of notes. You've got a lot more insights into how you can potentially create a much more inspiring, inviting, positive workplace for your teams. All of the links to stay connected to Daan and myself are in the description box below. And please like this video, like it right now if you enjoyed the content. And make sure to subscribe to the channel so that you know that you are made aware the next time an expert graces the Experience Creators stage. Don't forget everyone that one great experience has the potential to change someone's world.